Okay, this is the first lecture for Psych 360 post coronavirus outbreak. I am here in Iowa, and this is the first lecture for this online portion of it. We were talking about different anticholinergic psychedelics. We talked about belladonna. We talked about bromo dragonfly or bee fly. We talked about 4MA. We talked about STP. We talked about Nexus. Just a ton of different substances. Now we're going to talk about Jimson weed. Jimson weed grows all over the United States. I have it in my backyard behind my barn. It turns out it's a psychedelic plant found throughout the United States. Some people eat the seeds. They brew it in tea. They leave or they'll make the leaves into tea. They'll crush the leaves and make them into cigarettes. It's also known as thornapple, angel's trumpet, Jamestown weed, mad apple, moonflower, and stinkweed. And the reason it's called stinkweed is because it does smell bad. I've been fighting this stuff all my life. It grew wild in Indiana, and of course it grows wild here in Iowa as well. The substance produces the following effects: jerky movements, tachycardia, hypotension, hallucinations of snakes and spiders and lizards. Just heard a song by Jim Stafford where he he's kind of silly, and he shakes a snake or a frog at a lady, and she says, "I don't like spiders and snakes, and that's not what it takes to love me, you fool, you fool." Funny, funny song. You can listen to it anyway, anytime you want. The reason they call it angel's trumpet is, as you can see, the flower looks like a trumpet. The ones that I've seen mostly have pink flowers. This is kind of a lavender flower, and this is a white flower. But as you can see, you can see what the leaves look like. The seeds are in these pods right here, and you see these things all over the United States. As I said, I've got them behind my barn. I'll probably pull them out when they come up. It's not quite spring yet. None of the trees have budded except for the pussy willows, and we have crocuses that have come out. Yesterday we had about 2 or 3 inches of snow, but by the end of the day today we have no snow whatsoever. Ketamine, we use this in Vietnam. It's an anesthetic used for both humans and animals. We used it in Vietnam because it made the people forget. It took the pain away, and it made them forget the fact that they were wounded. And of course, it didn't make them forget it forever, but it made them forget it so that we could do surgery on them. Ketamine was used widely during the Vietnam War. It was liked because it does not affect the patient's breathing, but has the additional side effects of dissociation, feeling like you're outside of yourself, and that's one of the reasons why we used it. The liquid is crystallized, and the crystals are smoked in a pipe or snorted to the effects of mild dreamlike intoxication, sensitization of mind-body separation, dizziness, free-floating giddiness, slurred speech, impaired muscular coordination. And of course, here are some pictures of surgeries in Vietnam. The one on the right is a burn center in Saigon. The one on the left is Cam Ranh Bay. Of course, these are Air Force. These are both Air Force hospitals. Anyway, heavy doses of ketamine produce the psychedelic experience known as being in a K-hole, where the individual feels as if they are having an out-of-body near-death experience of depersonalization, hallucination, delirium, bizarre mystical experiences. They can feel no pain, kind of like PCP, respiratory depression, So they're breathing relatively shallowly, increased heart rate and blood pressure, combative or belligerent behavior, convulsions, and rarely they will go into a coma. Ketamine has been used as a date rape drug because it does knock you out. I mean, it is an anesthetic. So it does, people have used it as not only an anesthetic, but to rape young females. Phencyclidine hydrochloride, also known as PCP, was developed in the 1950s as a general anesthetic for humans. Didn't work. Didn't work because it tends to be toxic. It has hallucinogenic side effects. So they decided that they'd only use it on animals. But back in the 60s or into the 70s, when they're always looking for a new high, somebody found it in a veterinarian's office and used it as an animal tranquilizer. And, and unfortunately, of course, it hit the streets. It's a fairly simple chemical formula, so it's not that hard to make. Has really some pretty bad side effects, and this is one of the reasons why most people don't mess with it very much. It's also known as angel dust, peeps, KJ, Sherman's, or ozone. Why in the world is it called Sherman's? Because there used to be a character on Rocky and Bullwinkle, Sherman. Uh, he was he went back with somebody in his Wayback Machine. He'd go back in history. Anyway, that's why it's called Sherman's uh, because of that psychedelic experience of traveling through time with a dog on Rocky and Bullwinkle. It is sometimes sprinkled on marijuana and smoked in a joint. Can be smoked, snorted, swallowed, or injected. You can use it any way you want. And of course, it gives you a pretty good high. PCP seems to disconnect sensory messages sent to the central nervous system. It dissolves your inhibitions, so the people will do anything. I was reading stories about people on PCP, and evidently most of them have to do with the individuals taking all their clothes off and running down the street. They were talking about policemen found this guy running in a park, and he was naked, and of course he started chasing him. And so where did the PCP user go? He went back to where he got his PCP, and of course the policeman busted everybody in the party. But he ran right back to where he probably shouldn't have gone. Anyway, that was kind of odd. It dissolves your inhibitions, of course. That's why they take off all their clothes. It deadens pain, strange feeling. Oh, this was during the winter, too, by the way. Strange feeling of mind body separation, forgetfulness, difficulty concentrating, aggressive and violent behavior, depersonalization. 40% report hallucinations, tactile hallucinations, visual hallucinations, or auditory hallucinations. Damage can be done by the individual to themselves by overstressing their muscles, sinews, and flesh. And of course, since they're feeling no pain, a lot of times they just hurt themselves. And of course, by the time they wake up, they've torn they've torn all these muscles. As weird as this may seem, I had a friend in Montana who was on PCP while he was riding on a three-wheeler. Back then, it was they had three-wheelers instead of four-wheelers. Anyway, he was on a three-wheeler. He was on the back of the three-wheeler, and he had his arms out. And for some reason, the guy went under a telephone pole that was being held up by a guide wire. And of course, the guide wire hit the guy in the arm, and it cut his arm off. Of course, they're going as fast as they possibly can, so the blood's whipping backwards. So the guy doesn't realize what's going on. The guy that had his arm ripped off didn't realize it, didn't know it, and so they just kept driving around. He kept bleeding like a stuck pig, and eventually, of course, he passed out, and that's when the guy that was driving the three wheeler realized that there was something wrong when he started slumping and slipping off the three wheeler. So he stopped, of course, and then they discovered that 2 miles back the guy had ripped off his arm. The rest is history. He had surgeries, had numerous surgeries, and he married a colleague of mine, and which is kind of interesting, I guess. But that's how he lost his arm. He lost his arm because he was on PCP, I guess, and the guy ran under a guide wire, and he lost his arm. Salvia divinorum is a member of the mint family and produces a psychedelic effect when ingested. I've got this stuff behind my barn, right beside the Jimson weed. I'm thinking maybe there's marijuana out there too, but I'm not sure it's marketable. I think it's probably ditchweed, but looking at all this stuff and realizing that maybe the people we bought this place from were a little freakier than we thought they were when we bought the house. Um, the guy is it was a man and a woman, of course. They didn't have any children, but the man is in his early 60s and he suffers from Alzheimer's disease at this point. So possibly all the smoking of strange weeds and utilizing of all these hallucinogens has caused him to have Alzheimer's disease at a relatively young age. Anyway, Salvia divinorum is a member of the mint family and produces psychedelic effects when you ingest it. It tastes like mint, looks like mint, sure smells like mint. Creates dreamlike hallucinations, occasional delirium, and out-of-body sensations. I've never used this stuff. It's just that I understand what's going on. I've seen these people in the emergency room, and I got the stuff in my backyard, so I know that it smells like mint. When it's smoked, the effects last for only 7 to 10 minutes. Not much of a high, I guess. The key ingredient is salvironin. At present, the drug is legal, but under review for scheduling. They're not exactly sure if they will keep it as a drug. And this is what it looks like. It looks like any mint plant, as you can see from the right. But it has these really pretty purple flowers. And that may be why they planted it back there. I don't know. I'm not much of a Jimson weed Angel's trumpet fan, but I guess they could have planted all this stuff because of the flowers. Let's pretend anyway. Amanita mushrooms have been used for rituals as far back as Neanderthal man. The mushroom causes dreamy intoxication, hallucinations, delirious excitement, physical toxic effects that can be deadly. The effects start 30 minutes after ingestion and last for 4 to 8 hours. These are some of the magic mushrooms that people talk about. Active ingredients resemble the inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA. Too much of the mushroom will make the user sick, as if they have food poisoning. I was reading about Amanita mushrooms, and evidently they grew up in Alaska, Siberian Alaska. And what they'll do is, oh geez, and who knows if this is true, if this is just one of those horrible stories that people tell you. But the indigenous people will walk around and follow reindeer who are in the area, and when they eat the mushroom, the reality is that when you eat magic mushrooms, most of the psychedelic substance that causes the problems or that causes hallucinations, most of it is actually secreted out of your body. So you'll eat a mushroom, and you will only utilize about 20% of it. And they talk about shamans in Alaska walking around following a reindeer and watching the reindeer, and if they eat the red mushrooms, I'll show you what they look like. if they eat the red mushrooms, then they'll follow them around, and somehow they collect their urine when they urinate, and then they will drink the urine, and they'll get the the excess amount of this hallucinogen into their system, and then they will collect their urine and they will give it to their to people. They will have a hallucinogenic episode, and of course, then they will give their urine to other people, and they will drink the urine. This is theoretically it happens in Siberia with the indigenous people up in Siberia. I have no idea if that's true or not. It sounds like a fairly fantastic story, but as you can see, these are Amanita mushrooms. They're fairly distinctive as far as mushrooms are concerned. We have mushrooms here in Iowa, but they certainly aren't red, and they certainly don't have white spots on them. They're mostly morels. Dextromethorphan is the active ingredient in many cough syrups, including Robitussin DM, or Robitussin DM, Coricidin, and Romalar. I'm going to show you some pictures of other cough syrups that have dextromethorphan in them. 10 to 15 times the recommended dose can give the user euphoria, mind-body separation, auditory and visual hallucinations, loss of coordination, dilate pupils, decrease orgasm, nausea and upset stomach, itching rashes, fever, tachycardia, acute anxiety, and panic reactions. The dextromethorphan cough syrup was really popular in some of the party places in Los Angeles, in the clubs, and rappers would sing about dextromethorphan, drinking cough syrup and dancing all night, in a haze. But some people have overdosed on dextromethorphan, unfortunately, and have died from it. It was one of the things that they looked for. My son was a bartender at a club, a very famous club in Los Angeles, and this is one of the things that they would look for, people drinking cough syrup. And of course, if they did, they'd have to ask them to leave, as weird as that is. There you go, Robitussin DM Maximum. So it's got lots of dextromethorphan. These are NyQuil cough syrup, also has dextromethorphan, as does Delsum, and I'm not sure what the other one is, what the other cough syrup is. Anyway, nutmeg. Who would think this is something that is on everybody's shelves? Nutmeg. Turns out that nutmeg and mace both come from the nutmeg tree. I was asking my wife about mace. Mace is just another spice. It kind of tastes like nutmeg, I guess. What do we put nutmeg in? We put nutmeg in eggnog. That's one of the things you do. In heavy doses, they can cause mild floating sensations to full-blown delirium. Not exactly sure why you would want to be delirious, but I guess that's a high. Such heavy doses do have their price, of course. Bad hangover and severely upset stomach. This combination is rarely used outside of prisons where other psychedelics are unavailable. This is what the nutmeg nut looks like, and what they do is they make a powder out of the nut. But before they do that, one of the things they do is they take this orange shell out of the nutmeg, out of the nut of the nutmeg, and that's what mace is. It's the protective layer around the nutmeg nut, and it makes an orange substance, an orange powder, and that's the stuff that they're overusing in the prisons. Marijuana. Let's talk about marijuana. Marijuana is also known as cannabis or hemp plants. They're used to make powerfully strong fibers for rope. They have edible seeds, so you can actually feed them to animals, to livestock. It creates an oil that can be used as a fuel or as a lubricant. It is it's very, it's oil. What can we say about it? And it also has medicinal substances in it. It is illegal in most countries around the world these days. Cannabis is a plant that was developed in China and spread throughout the world for its medicinal properties and powerful fibers. Cannabis appears in writings from ancient China and India. In India, it appears in the Vedas as a divine nectar. Cannabis in the form of hemp was brought to the United States before the Revolution to grow for the ships of the Royal Navy, the English Royal Navy, of course. George Washington worked to expand his holdings to grow more and more hemp for profit. He was going to drain the swamps, the Dismal Swamp between Virginia and North Carolina, and they were going to plant hemp down there. It would have been a perfect situation, draining the swamps of the Dismal Swamp in order to make fields for fields of hemp. Hemp wasn't used for its psychoactive effects until after World War I, when migrant workers from Mexico introduced smoking the wacky weed to other poor migrant minority groups, including poor white people. The psychoactive properties of marijuana became popular during Prohibition, when the still legal pot was smoked for its psychoactive effects by those who sought a new high. Since they couldn't drink alcohol, now they were smoking pot. In 1937, marijuana was declared illegal. Hemp was legally grown during World War II, and the government even experimented with cannabis extracts to produce a truth drug. Didn't work, but they would transport the hemp plants by railroad, and so any place those railroads went, sometimes the seeds would jiggle out of the cars, and they would fall onto the side of the road, or they'd blow into the ditches along the railroad tracks. And one of the things and that's where ditchweed comes from. So if you drive around Nebraska, if you drive around Iowa, we've got all this ditchweed, and the reason it is there, it's actually hemp. It has very little THC, but the reason it's there is because, of course, we were transporting the hemp plants to make rope during World War II. Hemp is legally grown in France, Italy, and the Yugoslavian countries, England and Canada, to make paper, textiles, and rope, but not in the United States. It's illegal to, it's not anymore. We have changed our laws in the United States so that we can make clothes out of hemp and whatnot. Marijuana is legally used in the Netherlands in coffee shops. Actually, it's not marijuana that's in the coffee shops, it's hashish. 160 million people worldwide use some form of marijuana. I looked this up just before I started this lecture, and it said 55 million people in the United States are using marijuana now. And of course, it's legal in 11 different states. One of them is Illinois, which is right across the river from where I'm living right now. And oddly, and I guess this isn't that strange, but one of the things that we know about marijuana is that it is immunosuppressant. So the more you smoke, the more immunocompromised you are. Well, the states that have legalized marijuana have the highest levels of coronavirus infections. So if you look at Washington State has had more people die than any other state. The only state that hasn't legalized it that has a large number is New York. California is one of the top areas of coronavirus. Illinois, Colorado, all the states where it's been legalized, and I guess people don't realize what's going on as far as marijuana is concerned. It is immunosuppressant, and that's one of the things that you need to remember about marijuana. It is immunosuppressant. However, the counterculture movement in the United States that grew out of the civil rights movement, what am I talking about? Okay, Going into the 1960s, only about 2% of the people in the United States had tried any illegal drugs. And of course, people don't realize this because they think, geez, dude, I've watched the movie Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Everybody back in your era were tokers, dude. But the reality is, if you grew up in the 50s and 60s, nobody had a clue what any of this stuff was. It wasn't on the street. All the boys had crew cuts or flat tops. It just wasn't something that people did. They would sneak a beer, but that's about it. I mean, there was not a whole lot else going on until the Vietnam War, and of course, the Vietnam War caused people to rebel against the government. The Vietnam War itself, of course, was something that people were angry about. But there was also the civil rights movement going on, and that started in the 50s. Vietnam, of course, started in 1963. The war ended in 1975. So during that era, there was a lot of counterculture movement, counterculture going on in the United States. This huge movement, counterculture movement, and marijuana became part of that. Well, actually, drugs became part of that whole counterculture movement. By 1979, 68 million Americans had tried marijuana, and 23 million used it on a monthly basis. This is in 1979. Now, the war ended in 1975, but of course, the counterculture movement, long hair, hippies, the whole thing, all that was taking place, and there were a lot of people smoking dope. Well, in 1979, I was living in Germany. I was stationed in West Germany. So I kind of missed this whole thing. I missed a lot of television because I was stationed in Germany. Um, I missed Mork and Mindy. I missed The Great American Hero. I missed all these iconic television shows that nobody that went off the air before I got back. I got back in 1982. MTV started, and of course, it was a music video television. It was music television, is what MTV stands for. And we missed the beginning of it. Attempted control of the substance waxed and waned over the years, but a resurgence of marijuana prohibition in the 1990s led to a marked drop in its usage. By 1992, of course, we were trying to control things. 1992, just over 7 million people reported using marijuana on a monthly basis. They were arresting people, throwing them in jail for just using marijuana. By 2005, the number of monthly marijuana users doubled from 7,000 to 14,000. But in 2005, 3,200,000 people used marijuana on a daily basis. So as you can see, the whole thing had it becomes popular, it becomes less popular, and this is one of the reasons why a lot of people think that marijuana is there's no harm in marijuana. Well, we're going to talk about what harm there actually is in marijuana. It isn't something that doesn't hurt people. Every year, 80,000 emergency room visits occur because of marijuana usage. 44% of male adult arrestees test positive for marijuana. 32% of female adult arrestees test positive for marijuana. 57% of juvenile male arrestees test positive for marijuana. 32% of juvenile female arrestees test positive for marijuana. So as you can see, it has a lot to do with people being arrested. They're not being arrested because they're smoking pot. They're being arrested because they've committed a crime. So one of the things that we know now, since we're watching this and we're thinking of legalizing it nationally, one of the things that we are watching is what happens to people if they mix drugs. So if you smoke pot and drink alcohol, what happens next? Well, it either knocks you out and you go to sleep, or you may become violent. Alcohol, of course, takes away your inhibitions. Marijuana is supposed to make you mellow, dude, but that's not always what the result is. And so sometimes we have a problem when people smoke marijuana and drink alcohol. And as you can see, a lot of people who commit crimes are committing crimes whilst after smoking marijuana. The plant grown to make fiber is low in psychoactive substances and is referred to in hemp as hemp. This was on the news a couple weeks ago, well, a couple months ago, because they were having problems in New Mexico. They were seizing shipments of marijuana. They and of course it's legal to ship hemp in New Mexico, but it's not legal to ship marijuana in New Mexico. So they were stopping these semis full of hemp plants, and they had to check the THC to make sure it was really hemp. Well, hemp and marijuana don't really look the same. As you can see, the marijuana plant's a lot shorter than the hemp plant. The hemp plant is long and narrow. Doesn't have much. Isn't very. Doesn't have a lot of leaves. It's not very bushy. The plants grown to produce psychoactive resins are referred to as marijuana and are low in fibrous structure. And as you can see from the right, that's the stuff on the right is marijuana, and the stuff on the left is hemp. Once again, you can see that the hemp plant has a similar leaf to the marijuana plant, but doesn't nearly have the amount of it's not as bushy, doesn't have as many leaves, doesn't have the same top that marijuana has. Street names for marijuana include, and some of these street names have to do with different types of marijuana. Pot, of course. Muggles is another name for it. 420. Somebody explained to me why April 20th is marijuana smoking day. I haven't quite figured it. Well, I'm kind of stupid about these things anyway. Mary Jane, of course. Griffa, bud, herb, chronic, dank. African black is a different type of marijuana. Panama red is as well, and so is Acapulco gold. Humboldt green, Maui Wowie. BC bud is grown up in Canada, and Buddha Thai is also. These are all different types of marijuana, different types of growth. Humboldt green is grown in Humboldt County, California. Panama red, of course, is grown down in Panama. Acapulco gold is from Mexico. African black comes from Africa. Maui Wowie comes from Hawaii. BC bud comes from British Columbia, and Buddha Thai, of course, comes from Vietnam or Thailand, actually. Other names for marijuana is grass, leaf, ganja, charas, scents, weed, dope, dubage, dukind. So I don't know. It all depends on who you run with as to what they call this stuff. I guess usually they just call it marijuana, but I guess they don't have to. There's lots of other cool names like chronic and dank and herb. Marijuana comes in 3 distinct species, but hundreds of different hybrids. Cannabis sativa is the most common species. It's grown in tropical, subtropical, and temperate regions. It grows 5 to 20 feet tall. Plant grows from 1 to 5 pounds of buds and smokable leaves. Cannabis indica is another very strong marijuana plant. It grows in Southeast Asia. It's shorter, it's bushier, and is generally stronger smelling. And for this reason, of course, this is where they get hashish. And I'm going to show you what hashish looks like in just a second. Cannabis ruderalis is a smaller plant. It has very little THC, and they don't grow it to get high. Most marijuana is grown using the sinsemilla growing system, where male and female plants are separated before pollination can occur. By removing the plants before pollination can take place, the plants produce no seeds, and the THC is stronger. So they actually make the marijuana stronger by separating the males and the females from one another. This method is used with both the cannabis sativa and cannabis indica plants, and that's how they get these fabulous growths of marijuana. Dried marijuana leaves, buds, and flowers are crushed and rolled into cigarettes known as joints. It's also known as blunts. I can't think of any other names for it. That's okay. Marijuana can be smoked in pipes. In India, marijuana is divided into three different strengths depending on the part of the plant that is smoked. Bhang has the lowest potency and uses stems and leaves. Ganja is stronger and is from the stronger leaves and flowers, flowered tops. Charas is the concentrated resin and is the most potent. And I'm going to show you pictures. This is what bhang looks like. As you can see, there's a lot of leaves and stems in there. Not very strong. This is the top, the flowering top, and this is what ganja is. Once upon a time, I remember when this was occurring. Of course, I've never done this kind of stuff myself, but working in the emergency room and working as a collecting drug urines, we talked about this stuff from time to time. Once upon a time, they used to talk about ganja and Rastafarians smoking ganja. And what they were talking about was they were smoking the stuff with with a high THC level rather than the stems and leaves, the bhang. So in the Rastafarians were smoking this ganja, and it was really important. I was just looking at an article where they've lost the ability to make this stuff uh, in the Bahamas. That's where the Rastafarians are, and they're looking for they're looking for ganja plants, so that the plants with high THC levels. So they're wandering around looking for these things. Growing wild, I guess. Anyway, this is what ganja looks like. It's the flowers from the tops. If you go to a medicinal marijuana place and a shop where they sell this stuff, they have these buds in jars, and of course it all looks like this. But what you do is you crumble it all up and make it into a joint. This is what the resin looks like. This is what hashish looks like. You can roll it. What they do is they will take the top of the plant and they will rub it in their hands. And of course, the resin will come off into their hands. And then they will rub their hands together until they get little turds of hashish coming out. And that's what this stuff is. It's very strong. This is the stuff that they smoke in the Netherlands. So if you go to Netherlands and decide to go to a coffee shop, then you can potentially get some of this stuff. I had a friend who, golly, she married this guy, and the reason he married her was because she had an assignment to the Netherlands, and he wanted to go over there and smoke dope. You couldn't do it in the United States. This is back in the 90s, wasn't it? No, it was back in the 80s. Yeah, it was back in the 80s. Anyway, he didn't, I mean, there was, the whole point of the relationship was the fact that she had orders to go to Holland, and he wanted to go to Holland to smoke dope. So, that's why they got married. They were married for a couple of years. As soon as there were a lot of things that happened. Anyway, it didn't quite work out. So we won't go into that. But this is what hashish looks like. It's just resin that is rolled together, and you drop it in little ringlets like this, little cigar shaped things. Look like rat turds. Depending on the region of the country, only 10 to 50% of marijuana consumed in the United States is homegrown. Probably most of the stuff that is used in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, most of that stuff isn't homegrown. It's not Humboldt Green or Maui Wowie or whatever. It's stuff that's grown in Colombia and Mexico and smuggled across the border. Fairly easy to smuggle marijuana. We've found some fairly huge shipments of marijuana coming across the border. In the United States, inventive growers have gone to more and more creative ways of producing their product, from growing fields of the plant in the wilderness, back areas of national forests, to growing plants in grow houses using grow lights and hydroponics. They keep the grow lights on all the time. The hydroponics they don't use dirt. They grow it in water. Theoretically, it has a higher THC level. The typical marijuana plant contains over 420 chemicals. 30 of them have been found to be psychoactive. So we're not just talking about THC, but the most potent chemical is delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, also known as THC. When ingested, the psychoactive chemicals in the marijuana are converted by the liver into 60 other metabolites, some of which are psychoactive as well. So not only are you getting high from whatever is in the THC or the level of the THC, but also you're getting high from the metabolites, and it's a different high. So when you start smoking, you have one feeling, and then all of a sudden, this stuff breaks down, and your liver breaks this stuff down, and all of a sudden you've got a different high going on. Only about 20% of the THC in the joint is retained by the body, but the longer the smoke is held in the lungs, the more THC that is absorbed and the stronger the high. Modern marijuana contains as much as 4 to 25% THC as compared to the 60s, which averaged of 1 to 3%. And of course, all these old hippies from the 60s and 70s and 80s, the marijuana that they smoked ain't nothing like what they're smoking now, what the kids are smoking now. But of course, these are the guys that are getting the laws changed so that marijuana is legal. Most of the research from the past is based on the weaker marijuana, and of course, this is one of the problems that we have. It would be like looking at beer and trying to determine if whiskey was good or bad for you. And it's kind of the same situation. We've got all this research that we've done on marijuana, but the marijuana we have now is a lot stronger than the marijuana that we used to have. So some of the studies, this could go south really quick, just like the coronavirus is going south, and we're having more and more deaths and more people that are coming down with this disease. We need to really do something about it. We need to really understand it. We need to scientifically understand these things before we allow our children to smoke marijuana or to drink beer or to drink whiskey or whatever. We really need to understand what we're doing. Much to researchers' surprise, marijuana has its own receptors in the brain. Or at least that's what researchers thought when they discovered new receptors in the brain when doing marijuana research in the 1990s. Hence the name endogenous cannabinoid neurotransmitters, or CBs. The first endogenous neurotransmitter that was found to occupy the cannabinoid receptors was anandamide. CB1 receptors are found mostly in the brain, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the basal ganglia, including the nucleus accumbens, and the cerebellum. Now, if you think about what marijuana does to you, it messes up your memory. It mellows you out, dude. It makes you high, makes you feel good, and you can't walk very well. You can't function very well. So that's what's going on. I mean, you smoke marijuana, it takes up the anandamide receptor sites in the brain, in the hippocampus, the amygdala, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum, and of course, then you have the reaction to marijuana. It's all quite logical. Unfortunately, the CB2 receptors are found mostly in the immune system and in the lower body. Now, this is a problem because, as I told you before, marijuana is immunosuppressant. In other words, it really affects your immune system. And when we look at the coronavirus and what's going on, we can see that California, Washington, New York, of course, hasn't legalized marijuana. I don't think it's legalized marijuana. Let me take a quick look. Is marijuana, marijuana legal in New York? And the answer is lowered from $150. So it's not legal, but has been decriminalized in New York State. Generally illegal in New York, however, the Compassionate Care Act, which was passed in 2014. Okay, so the governor, Andrew Cuomo is the governor of, I'm sorry, I'm looking at this one right here. Andrew Cuomo is the governor of New York, and he has sworn that he will make it legal. Legalizing pot. Okay, well, it's not legal now, but it's been decriminalized. So, we can read a lot of this stuff into things. But whoops, I got rid of the wrong thing, didn't I? Where'd it go? Sorry. Okay, there we go. Okay. Anyway, so most of the states where the coronavirus is the worst are states that have legalized marijuana. They're talking about, geez, what damage is it going to do to the drug using population in all of these states? And the reality is, the people that are smoking marijuana are making themselves immunocompromised. So are people who smoke tobacco, but people who smoke marijuana are immunocompromised because it affects your immune system. CB1 receptors are in areas that integrate sensory experiences with emotions, and we already talked about that. That's the amygdala. Controls learning, that's your hippocampus. Controls memory, that's your hippocampus as well. Controls a sense of novelty, that's your basal ganglia. Controls motor coordination, that is your cerebellum. Opioids and cocaine overdoses are dangerous because they suppress the heart rate and respiratory functions of the brainstem. At the same time, it is almost impossible to overdose with marijuana because the anandamide receptors that it utilizes merely increase or decrease our minds to sensory input. And for that reason, people say that it hurts you less than alcohol. Well, that's true to some extent, but the effect may be longer lasting with marijuana than with alcohol. But of course, you can't overdose. You can't overdose on alcohol. You can drink yourself to death. Marijuana, you cannot overdose on. Marijuana is a vasodilator and so causes bloodshot eyes when it is used. So if you think somebody's been smoking pot, just look in their eyes. Their eyes are bloodshot and it kind of smells like pot, then you know that they have been using pot. This often leads to conjunctivitis. It also causes physical relaxation or sedation. That's the positive thing. It does control pain because of the areas of the brain that it affects. Coughing from lung irritation. So there is coughing that takes place. An increase in appetite, because that's what anandamide does. It tells you when you're satiated or not. Small to moderate loss of muscle coordination, of course, and this has to do with your cerebellum. Increased heart rate, decreased blood pressure, decreased eye pressure, decreased nausea, decreased ability to track movement, and after image of a moving object. One time I was playing in a softball tournament in Havre, Montana. It was an all-night affair. It was a co-ed tournament, and we played this one team, and they were really good, and they just kicked our fannies all over the place. But then we met them again. They kicked us into the losers bracket, and then they lost, and they came back, and we had to play them again. It was like 2 o'clock in the morning. 2 o'clock in the morning, and evidently it was somebody's brilliant idea on the other team to smoke a lot of dope, and so they came rolling out of their minivan, just like you see in Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I mean, it was that goofy. And they got out there, and I'll tell you what, they had to forfeit the game. We only played 2 innings, and we were kicking their fannies. And the reason was they couldn't catch the ball. And the reason they couldn't catch the ball was because they couldn't track the movement of the ball. This little tiny girl was playing first base. It was a throw from third base to first, and somehow the guy got a real good throw on it, and it came over, and she had her glove stuck out, but she couldn't. She didn't put it in the right place, and that ball hit her right in the forehead. I thought it killed her. It popped like you would have thought a melon had popped. Anyway, and that's when they forfeited the game because she was their ninth player. Yeah, she was their ninth player, and you can play with 8, but they decided not to since, I mean, they weren't making any plays, and it was ridiculous. We had batted around a couple times in the first inning. This was the second inning. The only reason they got us out was because people were laughing so hard that they'd strike out or something stupid. But I mean, it was a massacre, and it would have been a bloodbath, and it was already a bloodbath. That lady had a knot on her forehead the size of my fist. I mean, she was a cute little thing. Anyway, not the person I would have put on first base. But I mean, she had played at the first time we played them, and she'd played and had no problems whatsoever. But of course, the marijuana made her stupid and made her not able to track the ball, and that's not what you want in a softball game. Marijuana causes a small temporary disruption of the male hormone testosterone. While this is of little importance to most males, for those with a hormone imbalance or those going through puberty, it can cause some problems. And this is one of the reasons why we tell people that, and everybody, when they talk about legalizing marijuana, well, we'll make it only legal for 21-year-olds. Well, that's fine, but you're still going to have your teenagers that are smoking dope, and they're really screwing themselves up with when they smoke marijuana. It lowers their testosterone level. The testosterone decrease can also cause a lowered sperm count and sperm motility in chronic pot users, making it less likely that they will be able to reproduce. But of course, you can't use marijuana as a birth control. It doesn't work that way. Marijuana makes people hungry. It's called the munchies. When THC occupies the CB1 receptors in the hypothalamus that indicate satiation. Marijuana doesn't sharpen an individual's sense of taste. However, if you've ever been around somebody who has smoked pot and now has the munchies, they will eat anything. They will eat cereal with beer on top. I mean, they'll eat the dumbest things you've ever seen, things that you would never put together. They'll eat it. And of course, they think it tastes great, or they say they think it tastes great, but I doubt if they know what they're tasting. Marijuana also gives the individual a feeling of confusion about where they are, and eventually makes them feel deja vu, along with being drowsy, being aloof, and having difficulty concentrating. With the advent of marijuana high in THC, these varieties have more extreme effects. Giddiness, increased alertness to the point of hypervigilance. It's the paranoia that drives me crazy. People who smoke dope always think that somebody knows what they're doing, and they're after them. Drives you nuts. Major distortions of time, major distortions of color, major distortions of sound, sensation of movement under the user's feet, and of course you don't want to play softball if you think the ground is moving underneath you. Visual illusions, hallucinations, paranoia, and depersonalization. Marijuana users tend to act more empathic to others' feelings when under the influence of the drug. Marijuana also makes the user more suggestible. The main organ in the brain that is affected by marijuana is the amygdala, which regulates your appetite, your pain control, your anxiety, fear, suppression of pain memories, and sense of novelty. And of course, that's one of the reasons why we were giving people ketamine during the Vietnam War. We were trying to make them forget about the pain, suppression of painful memories, and that's what the ketamine did. When an individual uses marijuana, the THC artificially stimulates the amygdala, making even the most mundane objects and ideas interesting. I watched a guy, this is when I was in college, and I watched a guy look at the back of his hand, and he must have looked at the back of his hand for a half an hour, talking about the the blood vessels and the tendons in the back of his brain or his of his hand. And he kept saying, "Man, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen." And what he was looking at was the mapping of his blood vessels on the back of his hand. Just the dumbest thing in the world. If the individual overstimulates the CB1 receptors, these cells will downregulate, sometimes reducing these receptors by 70%. Now remember, the brain always wants to be normal, so it tries to protect itself. And in this case, of course, the amygdala is trying to protect itself from the downregulate or by downregulating the receptor sites in the amygdala, and they can be reduced by up to 70%. Now these are the receptor sites that tell you that something is interesting. They describe novelty to you. So here they are, they're downregulated. So as long as you're stoned and you're filling those receptor sites, then you're still being stimulated. But what happens after you're not stoned anymore? This reduction in CB1 receptors will result in the loss of novelty. Even the most novel stimuli will be boring to them. So while they're playing their video game, stoned out of their gourds and just having the time of their lives, as soon as they're not stoned anymore, what happens next? Well, what happens next is everything is boring to them. And if you've ever been around somebody that smokes a lot of pot, you can always tell when they've been smoking or when they haven't, because when they haven't been smoking, everything is boring to them, and they complain about it, and they're not happy, and they can't be happy because nothing is interesting to them. Everything is boring. For a marijuana smoker to continue working, studying, or even maintaining a relationship when not stoned takes a great deal of desire. Thus, the individual will be more likely to continue to use to combat the perpetual boredom they experience when they aren't stoned. Receptor recovery can take from 2 weeks for moderate smokers up to 6 weeks or longer for heavy smokers. Short-term memory is held in the hippocampus for immediate use. If this information is needed, it will be held until it can be transferred to the long-term memory. Anandamide receptors in the hippocampus dictate how much memory is available for immediate use. Because THC occupies anandamide receptor sites, it limits the amount of hippocampal short-term memory. The user may lose significant chunks of their lives while using because of the memory impairment caused by the THC. Marijuana slows learning and disrupts short-term memory, but doesn't affect long-term memory, though it does disrupt memory in general, attention span, and cognitive functioning. It's almost like giving somebody ADHD. Let's give them a drug that makes them act like they have ADHD. Oddly, users may feel that they are thinking deeper, which is really irritating. The guy looking at the back of his hand, he wanted me to look at the pattern of his blood vessels because he said it was God. God was talking to him through his blood vessels. Well, okay, fine. I'm glad that God talked to you through your blood vessels, but and he started telling me what it was that God was trying to tell him, but of course he forgot all of it by the time that he was no longer stoned. When the brain is developing, there is an explosion of the connections and synapses among the nerve cells in the frontal lobes around the age of 12. A great deal of pruning of these connections and synapses will take place through the next 10 to 12 years, depending on the use. Unused connections will be broken and discarded. Heavy marijuana usage during this time frame will change the brain structure. And this is why they say if you started smoking marijuana before the age of 12, then it affects your IQ because your short-term memory has been affected. Of course, if you're smoking marijuana throughout your high school years, then it's been affected as well. And so you're less likely to be able to remember things. Because of the distorting effects of marijuana, the individual may develop an impaired ability to determine danger, to organize, and to prioritize. And that's one of the reasons why these people have to be watched, because they keep getting into trouble. They don't recognize things. They don't think things are as dangerous as they actually are. Marijuana and MDMA use is especially destructive for memory, and that's one of the things that you have to remember. We know that somebody before the age of 12, it lowers their IQ. Now the question is how much IQ is lost by people who were just smoking in their adolescence, and the answer is there's still some memory or some IQ loss. Marijuana tends to give their user a distorted sense of time, and this is known as temporal disintegration. While this effect may help with dull, repetitive jobs, for more complex jobs like studying, the individual may become easily bored and quit. Temporal disintegration is part of the most debilitating aspects of using marijuana, along with impaired judgment and short-term memory loss. Multiple and interactive tasks can be impossible for these individuals. Distortion of time, impaired judgment, and short-term memory loss will be evident in the individual's behavior for up to 7 days after use. So you're stupid for 7 days. Congratulations. By 28 days, the individual has returned to what passes for normal for these select people. Let me tell you, as far as this temporal disintegration, it makes you drive slow. I was one night. I used to live in base housing, and base housing was maybe 2 miles away from the hospital. So we would drive through base housing. We'd go to the front gate, and then we'd go get onto the base, and then about half a mile down the road was the hospital. And of course, you had to make all these turns and whatnot. But it's about 2 miles. So one day I was on call, and they called me out. So I threw the kids in the car, and I jumped in my car, and I started out. Of course, in base housing, the speed limit was 15 miles an hour, I think. Maybe it was 20 miles per hour. Anyway, it was pretty damn slow, as you can imagine. So here I am. I'm trying to keep the speed limit, but I know that there's an emergency, and right in front of me pulls the X-ray tech. He was called out at the same time I was. He's in the same emergency that I am. So he's in front of me, and I can't get around him. And he's driving 10 miles an hour. He's driving half of what the speed limit is. And he's going, I could walk almost as fast as he was going. He was going so slow. Anyway, so here I am, I'm in my car, and I'm going, oh, come on, I've got 1.5 miles to go. And it just took him forever. It took us forever. And of course, he goes through the front gate, and I'm right behind him. And I still can't get around him. And I finally get there, and they start screaming at me because what took you so long? You're supposed to be on call. We needed you, 15 minutes ago. Why in the world are you so late? And I said, well, I got behind a really slow driver. I couldn't do anything about it. So I went to X-ray. I drew the guy's blood, started my test, went down to X-ray, and I said, dude, what's going on? Why in the world are you stoned or something? And I looked in this guy's eyes, and his eyes were so bloodshot. They were really, really bloodshot. Anyway, so he thought I was going to turn him in for smoking pot. I didn't. I could have, I guess, but I didn't do it. I figured, he's probably not going to do this again. I'm rationalizing it. Was a friend of mine. He was a friend of mine, but he thought I was going to turn him in. Well, he became really paranoid, so he put a hit out on me. He had connections in town, and he hired somebody to kill me, so that I wouldn't turn him in. And luckily, of course, I was a single parent at the time, so obviously nothing happened. But eventually, let's see, he played, he was one of the ends. I was one end on the football team, and he was the other end on the football team. He's also a fabulous basketball player. But the quarterback worked in my shop, And the quarterback went to him and told him that I wasn't going to turn him in, and that I was just kidding. I didn't know whether he had been smoking pot or not. The whole thing. And eventually he called off the hit. So I couldn't go to Lubbock. I was at Reese Air Force Base. Anyway, I didn't get killed, and I didn't turn him in, and I'm not sure what happened to him after that, but he was an X-ray tech. Funny guy, really good basketball player. Anyway, okay, that's temporal disintegration. Research into the effects of smoking marijuana on the respiratory system indicates that smoking 4 or 5 joints is as destructive on the mucous membranes and the lungs as smoking a pack of cigarettes. Now remember, smoking marijuana is still smoking. Just because it makes you mellow, dude, doesn't mean that it's not destroying your health. It also, of course, affects your immune system. But because it's destructive on the mucous membranes, smoking 5 joints is like smoking a pack of cigarettes. One of the things about cigarettes, of course, is that they're filtered, so they're not nearly as harsh. Marijuana is never filtered unless you're smoking a hookah, I guess. Anyway, they're rarely filtered. So there's a lot of destructiveness taking place. Remember, there's 420 chemicals. 60 of them are hallucinogenic. This is because marijuana isn't regulated as to its growth and refinement and is rarely filtered. Chronic use of marijuana can lead to chronic coughing and bronchitis. The most damage is done to those individuals who smoke with both marijuana and cigarettes. Marijuana smokers have increased mucus secreting epithelial cells, but decreased cilia to expel the excess mucus. For those who smoke both cigarettes and joints, they lose all the cilia in their mucous membranes, meaning that they will have to cough to expel mucus. Now, normally this stuff gets into your throat. You just kind of gag it up and spit it out. But for a marijuana smoker, that doesn't happen. The only way they can get rid of mucus in their lungs is to cough, and this may be one of the reasons why there are so many people dying from coronavirus in the states that have legalized marijuana. If they smoke marijuana, then their mucus clearing capabilities has been depleted, and because of this, if you can't get that stuff out of your lungs, then you develop pneumonia, and that's what people are actually dying from. The coronavirus is a form of pneumonia. It's a flu, and of course, it fills your lungs up with fluid, and then you die, and that's known as marijuana. That's known as pneumonia. While researchers have found that there is no link between marijuana and lung cancer, they've also discovered that marijuana suppresses the anti-tumor immune system response, leading to a greater probability of developing tumors, including breast tumors. Marijuana has also been found to increase replication of HIV, accelerating its progress. Because of its capacity to suppress the immune system, users tend to be more susceptible to colds, flu, and other viral infections like the coronavirus. The immunocompromised are not advised to use marijuana. One of the other things that marijuana does, it leads to buildup of fatty tissue. And they think the reason that you have an excess amount of fatty tissue is because it is fat soluble. So since it's a toxin and it's in fat, the fat becomes encapsulated. And these things are known as fatty lipomas. And of course, you can get these anywhere. I've got one on my leg. Doesn't have anything to do with marijuana, certainly, but I have one on my leg. So it's just an accumulation of fat in a select place. And of course, then it gets encapsulated, then it turns hard, and now you've got a lump someplace that you shouldn't have before. Marijuana strangely has an affinity for breast tissue. This is really kind of bizarre. So if you see an old movie from the 70s or 80s, and the individual the male individual was a dope smoker, then one of the things you'll see that his nipples, behind his nipples, he has fat pads. And these fat pads are actually fatty lipomas. So what's happening here is that he is developing these fatty lipomas behind his nipples. So if you watch an old movie from the 70s or 80s, and the guy takes off his shirt, which happened a lot in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, then what you might see is the fact that he's a dope smoker, and he's got fatty lipomas behind his nipples. Weirdest thing in the world. Uh, it's really odd to have all this information, because then you watch a movie from the 70s or 80s, and what are you looking for? You're looking for this guy with poochy nipples, uh, because he's a dope smoker, that kind of stuff. Of course, if it happens in women, you don't. And if you see her without her top on, then you don't know if it's normal fat or if it's marijuana fat. Marijuana routinely increases select mental problems like paranoia, of course, anxiety, and depression. If a person is on the edge, the confusion and depersonalization of the THC will very often tip the scales in a negative direction. Individuals who maintain a paranoid mindset while smoking marijuana might have exacerbated reactions with stronger blends or other drug mixtures. And we already know that marijuana doesn't give you schizophrenia, but it can reveal schizophrenia. So they people that have a proclivity for schizophrenia, they have the gene in their family. They would be advised not to smoke marijuana. Tolerance to marijuana occurs very rapidly. Often, new smokers will experience inverse tolerance, where they actually become more sensitive to the marijuana and have heightened sensations with less smoking. Marijuana's effects last for from 4 to 6 hours, but the substance may be detectable for up to 28 days and actually will stay in the body for up to 3 months. Because of the length of time it takes to rid the body of the substance, withdrawal from marijuana doesn't start until a longer period after the abstinence. So for this reason, you still have it in your system, and you don't go through the same withdrawal symptoms that you do from alcohol, which is processed out of your body very rapidly, or for heroin. You start having a negative reaction very, very quickly. But with marijuana, you don't, because it stays in your system for 28 days. It is detectable for 28 days. It stays in your system for a lot longer. So for the longest time, they didn't think it was addictive. Now we know that it is. It just takes a longer time to clear out of your body. Research has disclosed that despite the rumor to the contrary, marijuana smokers do go through withdrawals, though they are more delayed than any other drugs. And like other drugs, not everyone will go through all the withdrawal symptoms. Everyone will have cravings, of course. Other symptoms include anger, irritability, anxiety, and or aggression, aches, chills, and pain, depression, inability to concentrate, slight tremors, sleep disturbances, decreased appetite and stomach pain, and sweating. And it stinks. The sweat, I mean. Unlike most other drugs, marijuana has a stronger psychological addiction than physical addiction. Marijuana has just as strong chronic and compulsive use as any other drug. Unfortunately, marijuana's reputation is that it is non addicting, leading people into illegal usage and destructive circumstances with the idea that because it is less addictive, the behavior is all right. Well, as you can see, what you go through when you get off of this stuff doesn't look like a lot of fun. Adolescents are very sensitive to peer pressure. People who smoke marijuana tend to hang around other people who smoke marijuana, because this crowd has a more rebellious nature than, say, the chess club. Drugs tended to be around for the cool people to try. In this way, tobacco, alcohol, and marijuana are gateway drugs to heavier drug use. People who develop a pattern of use at an early age restructure brain cells toward continued addictive use. They create an addictive personality. Tolerance of less serious drugs may lead to a desire to refine that high. Researchers have found that almost everyone in treatment programs have started with the big three. Tobacco, first they start smoking, then they drink alcohol, and then they smoke dope. Marijuana use by 17 gives a 22.7 to 5.2 greater chance of heavier use in the future. Marijuana is the most widely used illicit drug in the world and is the drug of choice in many countries, including Australia, Canada, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Mexico, Panama, and South Africa. Um, well, it's weird. I was watching a television show made in Canada uh, on Saturday, and the lady had a hookah. She had a water pipe, an Egyptian water pipe for smoking marijuana. This is back in the 1920s, of course, but the Canadians have always been they decriminalized marijuana a long time ago. In the United States, penalties for possession and use vary from state to state. As a matter of fact, New Zealand is another country that has decriminalized marijuana. So there was a lot of marijuana smoking in Australia and in New Zealand and in Canada. So a lot of the good research comes out of New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. So anything that comes out of those countries, you can be assured that it's probably pretty good research since they've been smoking marijuana legally, well, not really legally, but they decriminalized it a lot longer ago than we did in the United States. I had a friend that from Vancouver who was talking about when he was a kid or when he was a teenager, he used to come into the United States, and when he went back across the border into Canada, he lived on the Canadian-U.S. border, and they would go to the United States for alcohol because it was cheaper in the United States than it was in Canada. So they'd party in the United States. Then when they'd be going back across the border, of course they couldn't. They since they were Canadian, they couldn't arrest them for possession. And of course, sometimes they just came across with stuff. And if they hadn't been caught one way, going one way, then of course they couldn't do anything. And they would stop them and harass them, of course, but they couldn't really arrest them. They couldn't do anything about it. And he used to harass. This is back in the 70s and 80s. He used to harass the border guards because they couldn't do anything about it. In the United States, penalties for possession and use vary from state to state. In 2004, 44.2% of the arrests for drugs were for marijuana. 90% of these arrests were for possession alone. Marijuana arrests almost doubled from 1980 to 2004. Other countries punished for marijuana: Austria, Belgium, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Italy, and Spain don't prosecute for small amounts for personal use. I was reading about England just before I started this lecture, and you can have what 2 ounces, and it's a $10 fine or something, £10 fine. In England, possession of marijuana could lead to 5-year prison term, though most sentences are minimal. In the Netherlands, marijuana use is limited to the coffee shops. Sales outside this system are illegal. So in the Netherlands, you can smoke your hash, but you got to do it in the coffee shops. You can't take it home. Some countries have the death penalty for the possession of hard drugs. Most of them are Muslim countries: Algeria, Indonesia, Iran, Malaysia, Singapore, Turkey, and Thailand. Thailand, of course, is the only country there that isn't Muslim. Other countries punish for marijuana. In Japan, possession is illegal, and people can go to jail for having less than an ounce of marijuana. Smugglers with larger amounts of marijuana will routinely be imprisoned for 3 to 4 years. Foreigners who are caught are deported after they serve out their sentence. These individuals will often be banned from re-entering Japan for life. And of course, that's one of the reasons why Paul McCartney cannot go back to Japan. He was caught with marijuana back in 1980, and they kicked him out of the country, and he can never go back to Japan. In India, an individual can be imprisoned for up to 10 years for smoking marijuana. Venezuela has a maximum of 10-year prison sentence. There you go. People caught for reckless driving or after having an accident are frequently not only tested for alcohol, but other drugs as well. In the case of marijuana, there are some circumstances that make this information erroneous. Marijuana stays in the system for weeks after it stops having a psychedelic effect on the individual. Elimination rates often vary by individual because of fat content. There is little accurate data about how much marijuana in the system causes impairment. There is often another drug in the system at the same time, and it's usually alcohol. And of course, if you think that the alcohol controls the behavior of the individual, you are incorrect. While the research is fairly concrete when dealing with alcohol and impairment, for marijuana it is not so simple. Statistics dealing with marijuana and traffic problems often involve polydrug use. 65% of heavy drinkers also use marijuana. People who drive under the influence of marijuana often are paranoid and drive too slowly for traffic. Research shows impaired driving for marijuana smokers up to 8 hours after smoking, and 60% failed 2.5 hours after smoking a moderate amount. A French study showed marijuana as a factor in 10% of the traffic accidents. A U.S. study showed marijuana as a factor in 4 to 14% of the injury or fatal accidents. Most drug urine tests place the cutoff for marijuana use at 50 nanograms per milliliter. For long-term smokers of marijuana, this amount of drug could be found in their system as long as 3 weeks after the last use. So they still have that much in their system. It would take a total of 6 weeks for a heavy smoker to test completely negative and of course, how impaired are they after 6 weeks of not smoking, after 3 weeks of not smoking? A first-time or infrequent user should be able to test negative 24 to 48 hours after use. The Olympic Committee sets a cutoff of negative at 15 nanograms per milliliter. Marijuana and its extracts have been used medicinally since the beginning of recorded history. It's been used as a muscle relaxant, as an analgesic. Analgesic means painkiller, as an appetite stimulant, to control spasms and convulsions, to calm anxiety, to treat asthma, to treat jaundice, to treat beriberi and ague, to stimulate childbirth, to relieve coughs, to treat withdrawal from opiates and alcohol, and as an antibiotic. Modern medicine uses marijuana or its derivatives to treat glaucoma. My brother has glaucoma, and he refuses to use marijuana or to use CBD oil. He puts eye drops in his eyes, and he doesn't want to have anything to do with that stuff. Nausea and pain, to subdue uncontrolled movements. This is what happens with multiple sclerosis. To stimulate weight gain for wasting illnesses such as cancer and AIDS. Unfortunately, abuses of the system have led to limitations on acceptance of marijuana for medicinal purposes. Marijuana and its derivatives containing THC have been incorporated in select pharmaceuticals. Duranabinol or Marinol and Sesamet are medications containing THC that can be given to individuals for nausea and pain control. It's probably the CBD oil that is actually working. Sativex is a spray that is used as an inhaler by people suffering from multiple sclerosis to aid with movement coordination. These medications are merely maintenance drugs. Some patients have complained that the drugs give them the feeling that they are getting better when they are actually staying the same or getting worse. If the patient has a history of addiction, the medications can lead to a relapse. My sister used Marinol when she was dying of cancer. It worked, but she hated it because it made her feel goofy, made her feel funny. And of course, she refused to take it. The National Drug Control Policy Commission researched the use of marijuana as a medication and came up with the following conclusions. Cannabinoids have a natural role in pain modulation, control of movement, and memory. THC has potential therapeutic value for pain relief, control of nausea and vomiting, and as an appetite stimulant. Smoking marijuana is a crude method of delivery of THC and also delivers potentially harmful substances. The psychological effects of cannabinoids include anxiety reduction, sedation, and euphoria, and can be therapeutic. Marijuana smoking is a serious risk factor for the development of respiratory diseases. And that is the end of the chapter. I think I'm going to stop here and pick up next time or on Wednesday as far as the next chapter, dealing with the next chapter. So